Alan Miles had always considered himself an ordinary man. Sure, he had a PhD in theoretical physics, worked as the head of a black hole surveillance program, and had a team of high-powered engineers and scientists at his disposal, but none of that mattered to him. It was all routine, really. He'd never been interested in the flashy headlines or the lofty expectations that came with his job. He preferred the quiet hum of his lab, the beeping of machines, the cool, sterile efficiency of it all. No drama. No excitement. Just numbers, theories, and controlled chaos. But today was different. Alan, you know you've got that big meeting with the board, right? His assistant, Rachel, poked her head through the door of his lab, a hint of impatience in her voice. Alan didn't look up from the screen in front of him. Yeah. I know, he muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. A routine diagnostic of the black hole surveillance system was underway, just a checkup, nothing special. He'd told the higher-ups that it was a precautionary measure, but the truth was, he'd been putting off the meeting for days. The board members always wanted him to spice things up with their reports, to present grand theories about controlling gravitational forces or saving the world with black holes. But Alan wasn't interested in flashy presentations. He was interested in precision, in cold, hard data. Which was probably why he had been relegated to the back offices of this unremarkable government facility. Tell the board I'm busy, Alan called out to Rachel without turning around. It'll be another half hour at least. Rachel sighed and closed the door, leaving Alan to his work. He clicked through the system's diagnostic protocols, his tired eyes scanning the readouts on his screens. The black hole surveillance system was a marvel of modern science, a giant, high-powered array designed to monitor gravitational fluctuations in real time. The system tracked the movement of objects across vast distances, detecting disturbances caused by black holes, cosmic anomalies, and any other object that might slip into the event horizon of a singularity. It was a tool of immense power, something that had the potential to alter the course of human history if it were used correctly. But so far, it had only been used to catalog data and study the theoretical implications of time and space. There were no grand experiments or breakthroughs to speak of. Alan was so absorbed in the diagnostic that he barely noticed the humming noise growing louder. Then, the system flickered. The screens flashed, and the diagnostic report started to glitch. Damn it, Alan muttered. He leaned forward, tapping keys in an attempt to reset the system, but the lights in the lab began to flicker, and the hum reached an ear-splitting pitch. Suddenly, the main monitor blinked out completely. Alan's heart skipped a beat. What the hell? A strange pattern appeared on the screen, a swirling, dark vortex. At first, it looked like some sort of visual artifact, a glitch caused by the system's malfunction. But it wasn't. Alan's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the shape immediately, the signature of a black hole's gravitational field. A mini black hole particle, something that had been designed years ago as a tool for simulating gravitational events. The system was never supposed to interact with it in this way. He'd heard about the risks, of course. Black hole particles could tear apart any object they came into contact with. A faint voice from behind startled him. Alan, is everything okay? I heard the alarms. It was Rachel again, standing in the doorway. Alan didn't answer. His hands flew over the keyboard, trying to reverse whatever the system had done. The particle was stabilizing, too quickly, too dangerously. Something was very wrong. Get out of here, he shouted, his voice tight with panic, but it was too late. A powerful force swept through the room, and Alan felt himself being drawn toward the monitor, toward the swirling blackness that had consumed the entire screen. He tried to move, tried to break free from the gravitational pull, but it was too strong. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Rachel's face, wide-eyed with shock. When Alan regained consciousness, he was sprawled on the floor of the control room. His head ached as though 1,000 needles had been driven into his skull, and his body felt strange, disoriented. He pushed himself up, glancing around. The room was still there, just as it had been before, but there was something off. The hum of the machines had changed. It was no longer just a background noise, but a low, reverberating thrum in his bones. He staggered to his feet, feeling the floor beneath him ripple as though it were made of liquid. His vision blurred for a moment. He blinked hard, trying to clear his mind. Something was wrong. This isn't right. As he stumbled toward the main console, his fingers brushed the edge of the desk. He could feel the air shift around him, like gravity itself was bending and twisting. Alan's hand hovered over the keyboard, and then, without thinking, he tapped a key. The screen flickered to life. At first, it seemed like the usual diagnostics. But then he noticed something. The numbers were changing. The coordinates on the map were shifting, as though the objects being tracked by the system were moving. No, not moving. Shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Alan blinked again, shaking his head. He swiped a hand across his face. Was he hallucinating? Something's wrong, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He looked down at his hands, feeling the tingling sensation in his fingers, like the very molecules of his skin were vibrating. He flexed his hand and watched in stunned disbelief as the air around him shimmered, distorting slightly, like looking through the heat waves on a hot summer road. With growing panic, Alan realized that the black hole particle he'd been working with wasn't just some experiment. It had merged with him somehow. The sensation of gravity, of space-time, felt different now. He didn't just understand it, he could feel it, could sense the way the world around him was shifting in ways he couldn't explain. A small object on the desk, a pencil, caught his attention. He focused on it, his mind fixating on the tiny, insignificant item. As if by instinct, he reached out with his thoughts, trying to move it. And then, the pencil floated, slowly, off the desk, hovering in midair. What the hell? Alan whispered, watching in disbelief. He waved his hand, and the pencil darted across the room. He didn't move. The object moved on its own, propelled by some invisible force. His heart raced. This wasn't possible. It was like he had somehow become the black hole particle, or it had become part of him. He had no explanation for it, no understanding of what was happening. The pencil fell to the floor with a soft clink, and Alan took a deep breath. I have to calm down. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't a small problem. This was huge. This was a disaster in the making. He glanced at the monitors again. The black hole surveillance system was still running, and the data readouts were even more erratic now. But something caught his eye on one of the displays, a strange symbol, a pattern forming in the data, as if the system were trying to communicate something to him. It was only then that Alan realized the full scale of what had happened. He hadn't just altered the flow of objects in his lab, he had somehow tapped into a power that was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. And he had no idea what to do with it. The room began to spin, and Alan staggered toward the door. He needed to get to the control center, to stop whatever had happened from spiraling out of control. But as he reached the door, the air around him thickened, and he felt himself being pulled back toward the monitor. The black hole particle was still active. And now, it was pulling everything around him into its orbit. Alan staggered back toward the control center, but the floor beneath him seemed to ripple, as though the very ground was bending and warping with each step. It wasn't just that the space felt different, it was that he felt different, as if his body had become somehow untethered from the normal laws of physics. He reached for the door handle and, as he did, the metallic surface rippled under his touch, distorting as though it were made of liquid. His heart pounded in his chest. No. No, 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 Alan muttered under his breath, trying to steady himself. The sensation of being pulled by some invisible force was intensifying. He forced himself to focus. Think, Alan. Focus. In the corner of the room, the black hole monitor was still running, displaying readings he couldn't make sense of. The numbers weren't just fluctuating, they were warping, spiraling into chaotic patterns. Alan had never seen anything like it. He'd spent years studying the theories behind space-time manipulation, and yet here he was, standing in a world where those same laws were breaking down before his very eyes. The black hole particle was still active, still tethering itself to him. Alan could feel it, a faint hum beneath his skin, like an invisible pulse. He had no idea what to do with this power, no idea how to control it. But the more he tried to resist, the more everything around him seemed to spiral out of control. The object on the desk, the pencil, which had hovered in the air a moment ago, was now spinning rapidly in place, as though caught in some invisible whirlwind. Alan watched in horror as it sped up, moving faster and faster, before it shot off the desk and collided with the far wall with a violent crash. "God," Alan whispered, his voice trembling. He wasn't even touching the damn pencil, and yet it seemed as if his will was shaping reality itself. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, until Alan couldn't hear his own thoughts. His skin prickled with static electricity, and the very air seemed to distort, bending light in unnatural ways. He raised his hand, half out of instinct, half out of a desperate need to understand what was happening to him. A flicker of movement in the corner of his vision caught his attention. He turned his head and saw the control panel. The screens were flashing warnings: gravitational instabilities detected, signal failures, data corruption, and, most alarmingly, the countdown to an unknown event. The numbers were dropping rapidly, faster than Alan could comprehend. Shut it down, he thought. He needed to shut the system down. It wasn't just malfunctioning, it was expanding outward, rippling through the lab like a spreading infection. If he didn't stop it, the whole facility could collapse. But the more he focused on the screen, the more distorted it became. His vision swam, and the data blurs turned into strange, disorienting patterns, as though the space around him was becoming unreal. His fingers twitched involuntarily, reaching out toward the monitor, and the moment his hand brushed the screen, the entire panel froze. The numbers stilled, and everything fell silent. Alan pulled his hand back, but the silence didn't last. The hum in the air grew deafening, and he felt his body begin to tremble as though the gravitational forces were pulling at him from every direction. He gritted his teeth, trying to maintain control, but the pull, whatever it was, felt inescapable. It was as though the black hole inside the system was reaching out, pulling him closer, demanding to be fed. Before he could react, a metallic shriek echoed through the lab, followed by the unmistakable sound of twisting metal. Alan whipped his head around, and his eyes widened in disbelief. A piece of equipment, something large, heavy, was lifting off the floor. It was hovering in midair, twisting slowly as though caught in a current. Alan's breath caught in his throat. "I'm doing this. I'm making this happen." "No," he muttered, backing away from the floating object. This can't be real." But it was. He could feel it, feel the pull of the black hole energy coursing through his veins, the twisting of space itself. The very air around him felt dense, like gravity had increased 1,000-fold, pressing against his skin, squeezing the air from his lungs. The equipment jerked in midair, and Alan instinctively reached out to try and stabilize it. His hand was trembling, but when his fingers brushed the metal, the entire object shuddered, vibrating violently before it snapped in half with a sickening crack. Half of it vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a fading ripple in the air. "Shit," Alan hissed. He'd just watched an entire piece of equipment disappear before his eyes. Vanished. Like it was never here. He turned back to the control panel, frantically trying to understand the data. The countdown was ticking faster now. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just affecting his lab. It was affecting the entire system. If the black hole particle had gone rogue, it could be pulling everything into a gravitational collapse, starting with the building and spreading outward. Alan ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him like an anvil. How do I fix this? How do I stop it? And then, just as quickly as the chaos began, the hum suddenly stopped. Everything went still. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Alan stood frozen in the center of the lab, sweat dripping down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart was racing, the silence almost unbearable. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. He looked around the room. The floating equipment had returned to the ground. The pencil was resting on the floor, undisturbed. The monitors were still flashing warnings, but the countdown had stopped, and then he realized something that made his blood run cold. The black hole particle wasn't just some piece of equipment anymore. It was inside him. He could feel it, pulsating like a dark heartbeat, thrumming through his body. His senses were sharp, but not in a normal way. He could feel the bend of space itself around him. He could hear the hum of gravity itself. What the hell did I do? Alan whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. He reached down and picked up the pencil, his fingers brushing it gently. His mind was still reeling from the events unfolding, but when he focused on the pencil, it began to levitate again. Slowly at first, but with growing intensity. Alan's heart leaped in his chest as he realized he could control it with just a thought. He wasn't just observing the effects of gravity anymore. He was gravity. The realization hit him with full force. Whatever had happened when the black hole particle fused with him, it had changed him. It had given him the ability to shape space, to manipulate objects, to control reality in ways that he could barely understand. Alan dropped the pencil, and it fell with a soft clink. He wasn't sure if he should be exhilarated or terrified, but the sense of control, of power, was overwhelming. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. Focus, Alan. He had to get this under control. He had to stop the system before it got worse, but the deeper he thought about it, the more he realized how dangerous this was. The black hole's power wasn't just some scientific anomaly, it was a weapon. And he had just become its weapon. The door to the lab slid open with a soft whoosh. Alan whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. Rachel stepped into the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Alan, what's happening? What did you do? Alan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He didn't know how to explain what had happened, how to tell her that he had unleashed something so much bigger than himself. Instead, he simply reached out toward her, and as his fingers brushed the air, the space between them distorted. Rachel's eyes widened. She staggered back, but not fast enough. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, and with a sudden jerk, the air twisted, pulling her toward him. Alan's heart hammered in his chest. He hadn't meant to do this, hadn't meant to pull her in. No. Stop, he cried, but the force didn't listen. Rachel was caught in the distortion, her feet lifting off the ground, her hands flailing as she struggled to regain control. Alan's mind raced, his panic rising. He didn't know how to reverse this. He didn't know how to stop the power from consuming everything around him. Rachel's face turned white with fear as she was yanked toward him. She slammed against the console, gasping for breath. Alan reached out with both hands, desperately trying to release her from the grip he'd accidentally put her in. And in that moment, the distortion flickered, just long enough for Rachel to tumble to the floor, gasping for air. Alan, she whispered, her voice trembling. Alan fell to his knees beside her, his heart racing, his mind swirling in panic. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't some experiment. The power of the black hole particle was real. And he was in over his head. Alan's hands shook as he knelt beside Rachel. She was gasping for air, her wide eyes locked on him, her face pale with shock. The strange distortion in the air had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her on the floor, still trembling but alive. But Alan wasn't sure how much longer that would last if he couldn't control this, whatever this was, that was happening to him. Rachel, his voice cracked, and he reached out, his fingers brushing her arm. He had to make it stop. He had to fix whatever he'd done. Her breath came in shallow, terrified bursts. What the hell, what was that? What did you just do to me? Her voice was thin, strained with panic. I didn't mean to, Alan stammered, pulling his hand back. The horror of what had just happened settled like lead in his chest. The power inside him, his body was literally warping spacetime. It wasn't just affecting objects anymore, it was pulling people into it. His stomach twisted with the realization that he had no idea how to stop it. Rachel, still disoriented, pushed herself into a sitting position, her gaze flickering over the room. The chaotic energy that had filled the air moments ago seemed to have evaporated, leaving only the quiet hum of the machines in its wake. "Alan, you've got to explain what's going on here," Rachel demanded, her voice sharp with a mix of fear and anger. "This is beyond crazy. The lab, She stopped, her eyes fixing on something behind him. Alan turned, following her gaze to the monitor. The screen was still showing strange fluctuations, but now there was something worse, a countdown. The numbers were ticking away with maddening speed, slipping further out of control. What is that?" Rachel asked. Alan didn't answer at first. He was too busy watching the countdown. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. He'd been working with the black hole particle in a controlled environment. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd designed the system to analyze space-time anomalies, not become one. I'm not sure," Alan said, shaking his head. "But I think the black hole particle, it's inside me now. It merged with me. I can feel it. It's warping everything. The system, the lab, this whole facility, nothing is stable anymore." Rachel looked at him, eyes wide. "You're telling me, you're not just the head of this system anymore? You're a part of it?" Alan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I don't know. It's like the system is alive. Like it's controlling me now. I'm not just running it, Rachel. It's part of me." He shuddered, unsure how much sense any of it made. "And if we don't shut it down, if I can't get control of it, we're going to lose the entire facility. It's already spreading beyond this room." "Then shut it down," Rachel shouted, her panic rising. "Do something. Before it gets worse." Alan nodded, standing up quickly. He moved toward the console, his steps shaky but determined. But when he reached for the control panel, the air seemed to crackle with static. His fingers hovered over the buttons, but his hands stopped just before they made contact. The machines, the systems, everything felt too alive, too responsive, as if they were anticipating his next move. A warning flashed across the screen: "Gravitational instability detected. Current trajectory is unsustainable." The countdown continued, relentlessly ticking toward some kind of unknown disaster. He could feel the tremor in the air. The pull in his chest was growing stronger, pulling on him, on everything around him. He could hear the hum of space bending, warping. It was only a matter of time before everything collapsed into the event horizon. "Rachel," Alan's voice was hoarse as he turned toward her. "You need to get out of here. You need to leave before." "No." She shot up from the floor, standing beside him with wide eyes. "I'm not leaving. We fix this together." The words were harsh, but Alan could hear the underlying desperation. Rachel had always been determined, fiercely intelligent, yes, but this wasn't something that could be solved with willpower alone. It was a force far beyond their understanding. He didn't argue. There was no time. The countdown reached 0, and everything in the lab seemed to freeze. A pulse of energy shot through the room, a violent wave of gravitational force that slammed Alan against the far wall. He heard a sickening crack, and then darkness. When Alan regained consciousness, he felt different. The air around him was different. He wasn't just aware of it anymore. He was part of it. The space itself seemed to wrap around him, bending under his control, at his will. His thoughts were clearer now, sharper. He could feel every atom in the room vibrating. He could hear the pull of the black hole inside him, thrumming like a heartbeat. It was too much. His mind felt like it was being stretched, pulled in every direction. He didn't have control, not over his body, not over the system, not even over his own thoughts. The black hole was inside him, whispering in ways he couldn't understand. He had to stop it. Alan, Rachel's voice pulled him from the fog. Alan, are you okay? He turned to find her standing near the control panel, her face pale but determined. She was staring at the screens, at the data flashing before her. I can't stop it, Alan. The system is too far gone. I can stop it, Alan whispered, cutting her off. The realization hit him like a sudden surge of power. He didn't need to shut the system down. He didn't need to reverse the countdown. He could reshape it. He could manipulate the trajectory, adjust the gravitational pull, stabilize the system. He had the power to make it all work. If he could maintain control, but control was slipping fast. Alan could feel the black hole inside him, alive, writhing like an angry beast trying to break free. He wasn't sure how long he could keep it contained, how long his mind could withstand the pressure before it snapped, but Rachel was watching him. Her eyes were filled with a mix of fear and hope. Please, Alan, she said softly. Fix this. Alan swallowed, focusing on the console, on the readings. He took a deep breath and pressed his hands to the surface of the panel, just like he had done with the pencil earlier. His fingers tingled as the energy around him hummed, vibrating in sync with the systems. The air seemed to thickening, swirling as though a storm was gathering in the room. He pushed harder, reaching for the core of the system, trying to bend the gravitational field without breaking it. The numbers flickered, then stabilized, just for a moment. The countdown halted, the system's pulse steadied, but Alan's hands were shaking. He could feel the black hole particle twisting inside him, pulling harder, deeper. It was too much for him to handle. The strain, the pressure, it was unbearable. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pull stopped. The hum in the air went quiet. Alan looked up to find Rachel staring at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with something between disbelief and awe. You did it, she whispered. For a brief, fleeting moment, Alan felt a surge of triumph. He had stopped the collapse, stabilized the system. He had regained control, at least for now, but as his vision swam and his body trembled from the effort, he realized that it wasn't over. The black hole inside him wasn't gone. It hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. Waiting for the next moment when it would break free. Alan staggered back, trying to catch his breath. I don't know how much longer I can keep this together, Rachel. It's in me, and I don't think it'll ever leave. Rachel stepped forward, her expression softening. Then we fix it. Together. Alan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. I don't know if I can fix it. But I'll try. And for the first time since the disaster had begun, Alan wasn't sure if they were going to make it out of this alive. The black hole inside him was a force beyond comprehension, and he wasn't sure if even his newfound power could stop it, but he had no choice but to try.